The salt-laced wind tore at Dean's coat, a relentless icy hand pushing him forward, further into the island's embrace. The small fishing vessel, its engine a low, guttural thrum against the churning gray water, felt less like transport and more like a reluctant delivery service to some forgotten corner of the world. He gripped the cold metal rail, knuckles white, the spray a stinging slap against his face. It had been months since the silence had truly settled, since the last echoes of laughter and life had faded from his own walls, leaving behind only the hollow ache of what was lost. This island, an inheritance from a grandfather he barely knew, was meant to be an antidote, a desolate balm for a soul worn thin. The fog was a living thing here, a thick, shifting shroud that swallowed the horizon whole, leaving only the immediate turbulent water visible. He'd studied maps of this place, charted its treacherous coastline in intricate detail during his own distant academic life. But maps never conveyed the oppressive feel of a place. This wasn't just remote. It felt like the edge of existence. Finally, a shape materialized through the swirling mist, a craggy, unforgiving shore, then the stoic, weathered column of the lighthouse, its beam cutting a slow, deliberate arc through the gray. Beside it, hunkered low against the wind, stood the keeper's cottage. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, more exposed, a solitary sentinel against an indifferent sea. As the boat scraped against the small, barnacle-encrusted dock, the deckhand, a burly man whose face was a roadmap of sun and salt, offered a curt nod. "Last stop, mate. Good luck with the quiet." Dean didn't reply, just hauled his duffel bag and a box of cartography tools onto the slippery planks. The path to the cottage was overgrown, a testament to years of neglect. Tufts of wiry grass pushed through cracked flagstones, and the air was heavy with the scent of brine and damp earth. The cottage itself was a study in decay. Paint peeling like sunburnt skin, windows opaque with salt and grime, the wooden porch groaning under his weight. He fumbled with the rusted iron key, its cold metal biting into his palm, until the lock groaned open with a sound like a dying gasp. Moonlight, filtered through the grimy panes, cast a weak, watery glow across the main room, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. He stood there for a long moment, listening. Only the ceaseless roar of the waves outside answered, a constant, hungry sound that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the house. He moved slowly, his footsteps heavy on the warped floorboards. The kitchen was a relic, a cast-iron stove encrusted with rust, a few chipped plates stacked neatly in a cupboard. His grandfather's presence, or rather his absence, hung in the air. A ghost of a life lived in stark isolation. Dean felt a profound weariness settle into his bones, a weight that had nothing to do with the journey. He had come here seeking emptiness, and the cottage offered it in abundance. But it was an emptiness that seemed to amplify his own. He pushed open a door at the far end of the hallway, revealing what must have been his grandfather's study. This room was different. It felt less abandoned, more simply paused. Maps, yellowed and curling at the edges, were tacked to the walls, some bearing his grandfather's intricate notations in faded ink. A heavy oak desk dominated the space, littered with nautical charts, compasses, and odd-shaped measuring tools. A half-finished model ship sat under a dust cloth. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the desk, tracing the faint indentations left by countless hours of work. His gaze drifted to a small, hidden compartment beneath one of the desk's drawers, a clever spring-loaded mechanism he only noticed because of a slight misalignment in the wood grain. Curiosity, a rare visitor these days, stirred within him. He pressed the catch, and the panel slid open with a soft sigh of displaced air. Inside, tucked away as if meant to be forgotten, lay a single leather-bound journal. He didn't open it, not yet, but a shiver traced its way down his spine. A low, distant thrum vibrated through the floorboards, too deep to be the waves, too regular to be the wind. He walked to the grimy window overlooking the cliffs. Through a brief parting in the relentless fog, he glimpsed it. A cluster of low-slung utilitarian buildings perched precariously on a distant higher promontory. The research station, as it had been vaguely described in the inheritance papers. It looked utterly out of place, a stark functional scar on the wild landscape. For a fleeting moment, as the fog swirled back to obscure it, Dean thought he saw a single, intensely bright light flash from one of its windows. An unnatural, pulsing gleam that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, unsure if it was real or merely a trick of the light and his own tired eyes. The cottage was smaller than Dean remembered from the old photographs, its whitewashed walls stained with salt and neglect. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, and the air hung heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, a faint, briny tang that wasn't quite ocean. He spent the first few days in a haze of unpacking and cleaning, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the gnawing emptiness inside him. He scrubbed away years of grime, revealing scarred floorboards and a stone hearth choked with cold ash. The silence, initially a balm, soon began to press in, magnifying every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind against the rattling window panes. His cartography tools remained untouched in their box, a silent reproach. He'd come here to work, to lose himself in the precise lines and measurements of the earth. But the island's raw, untamed landscape felt too vast, too indifferent to be contained by a map. Instead, he found himself drawn to the windows, staring out at the turbulent gray sea, watching the relentless advance and retreat of the tide. It was the tide that first unsettled him. He was a man of patterns, of observable phenomena, and the ocean's rhythm had always been predictable, a constant against the shifting world. But here, the water behaved erratically. One morning, the high tide surged far beyond its usual mark, licking at the base of the cottage's stone foundation with an unnatural veracity. He watched, transfixed, as the waves hammered the shore, their roar deafening, before receding just as swiftly, exposing vast stretches of glistening, unfamiliar seabed for hours longer than they should have. He checked his grandfather's old tide charts, yellowed and brittle, but they offered no explanation. The patterns were wildly off. Then came the sounds. At first, he dismissed them as the wind. The island was exposed, and the gales that swept across it were fierce, capable of producing all manner of mournful howls and whistles. But these were different. They were low, resonant, almost melodic, like something vast and ancient sighing just beyond the reach of his hearing. Sometimes they seemed to carry words, indistinct and guttural, clinging to the salt-laden air. He told himself it was the isolation, the profound quiet making him susceptible to auditory illusions. Yet the sound would return, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards, a hum that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the very marrow of his bones. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge, Dean began to explore the cottage more thoroughly, not for cleaning, but for clues. He found the journal tucked away in a dusty sea chest in the back of a small, forgotten closet, beneath a tangle of old fishing nets and mildewed oilskins. It was bound in heavy, salt-stained leather, its pages swollen and warped by moisture. He recognized his grandfather's spidery, precise handwriting, but the content was unlike anything he'd ever known of the man. The initial entries were mundane, observations about weather and supplies, but as he flipped through, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic. The ink bled in places as if the pages had been soaked. Interspersed with the increasingly erratic prose were disturbing sketches, swirling, abstract forms that hinted at something colossal beneath the waves. Impossible geometries, and figures that were vaguely humanoid yet horribly distorted. Their features stretched and blurred as if seen through murky water. They made his skin crawl. One entry, dated years before his grandfather's disappearance, stood out. The words were almost illegible, scrawled with desperate urgency. The deep song, it calls. The tides answer. It remembers the pact. The encroachment begins. Cannot fight the pull. They will come for the others. Another page, half torn, read, "The research station. They were warned. Fools. The hum, always the hum. It changes things, makes you forget what's real." Dean's breath hitched. The deep song. The phrase resonated with the strange, resonant hum he'd been hearing. He tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man succumbing to isolation, a lighthouse keeper's lonely madness. His grandfather had always been a solitary figure, but never one prone to such wild imaginings. He was a practical man, a man of the sea, not of fantastical horrors. He closed the journal, the leather cool and damp beneath his fingers. He needed more information, something to anchor him to reality. The mention of the research station sparked a flicker of purpose. He remembered seeing a small, dilapidated structure on his maps, a few miles down the coastline. He would go, he decided, and prove to himself that these were nothing more than natural phenomena and the product of a grieving mind. He had to rationalize it. The alternative was unthinkable. Dean's breath hitched, the memory of his grandfather's scrawled words. The deep song, a cold knot in his stomach. But the phrase now resonated with a distinct, unsettling clarity, mirroring the low thrum that had become a constant, subtle pressure behind his eardrums. It wasn't the ramblings of a lonely old man anymore. It felt like a clue, a key. He spent the next morning in a feverish dive through his grandfather's belongings, not just the journal, but boxes of old maps, nautical charts, and brittle local histories. His cartographer's instincts, usually so precise and ordered, were now fueled by a frantic need for answers. He needed context, a framework to understand the escalating strangeness. The island's official records, sparse as they were, offered little beyond lighthouse maintenance logs and fishing yields. Dean needed something older, something forgotten. He remembered a mention in one of the official documents, a small defunct research station on the island's eastern side, once used for marine biology studies decades ago. It was a long walk, a winding path through gnarled, salt-blasted trees that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The research station itself was a low, squat building of weathered gray stone, half obscured by overgrown brambles. Its windows were opaque with grime, and the door, when he finally pushed it open, groaned in protest, releasing a puff of stagnant, dust-laden air. Inside, it was a mausoleum of forgotten knowledge. Shelves crammed with yellowed reports, specimen jars containing murky, unidentifiable forms, and a long, scarred wooden table littered with rusted instruments. A thick layer of fine gray dust coated everything, muffling the sounds of his own footsteps. Dean worked methodically, brushing away cobwebs, pulling down dusty tomes. He found geological surveys, tide tables, and records of various marine species. Nothing. It contained not scientific data, but a collection of local folklore, transcribed interviews with island elders, and archaic maps. His fingers trembled as he opened a brittle, leather-bound volume titled Island Whispers, Legends of the Deep. The pages, crinkled and foxed with age, spoke of an ancient, pre-human civilization submerged beneath the waves surrounding the island. Not a natural disaster, the text implied, but a deliberate descent. The pact involved offerings, rites of appeasement, and a binding song to maintain the veil between worlds. The deep song. He reread entries, seeing them through this new, terrifying lens. The hum grows louder. The pact weakens. They forget the rites. The sleeper stirs. The old man hadn't been mad. He'd been documenting a slowly unfolding horror. He'd been trying to warn someone. His mind reeled with the implications of the legends, the weight of a forgotten history pressing down on him. The island wasn't just remote. It was a prison, or perhaps a guardian. That night, his sleep was not the peaceful oblivion he craved. He dreamed of the sea, not as a vast, open expanse, but as an endless, crushing weight. He was underwater, the pressure immense, yet he could breathe. Around him, colossal structures of an unknown cyclopean architecture loomed in the perpetual twilight, their surfaces slick with an alien slime. He saw figures, indistinct and elongated, moving with a disturbing grace through the watery gloom, their forms twisting into impossible shapes. Dean woke with a guttural gasp, the phantom pressure still squeezing his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the receding echoes of the dream. He swung his legs out of bed, needing to ground himself in reality. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from beneath the old, battered chest of drawers across the room. He stared, disbelieving, then slowly approached. Sprouting from a hairline crack in the dry, unpainted wood, and even clinging to the base of a forgotten ceramic pot, was a cluster of algae. It wasn't the dull green of seaweed. This was a vibrant, almost electric blue, pulsating with a soft, internal luminescence. It pulsed gently, like a slow, deep breath, casting an unsettling, shifting light on the floorboards. Dean drew his hand back sharply. This wasn't just a dream or a legend. The deep was rising. It was already here, within the very walls of his inherited sanctuary. It had been a whisper at first, a suggestion of sound indistinguishable from the wind's mournful keen around the cottage's ancient stone. Now it was a persistent, hypnotic hum, a low, resonant frequency that permeated the silence, a sonic fingerprint of something vast and deep. He stood in the narrow hallway, the damp chill from the sea seeping through the walls, and listened. The hum wasn't uniform. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate beat, like a colossal heart struggling against an immense pressure. He pressed a hand to the rough plaster, feeling a faint tremor beneath his palm. It wasn't the house settling. This was different. This was alive. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the living room. Dean flinched, his shoulders tightening. He moved slowly, cautiously, his gaze sweeping the familiar, cluttered space. A heavy, leather-bound volume, one of his grandfather's old maritime tomes, lay open on the floor beside the armchair, as if it had simply slid off the small, unsteady side table. He hadn't touched it since he'd arrived. His brow furrowed. Had he left it too close to the edge? He knelt, picking it up, his fingers brushing over the brittle, yellowed pages. A faint, briny scent, like stagnant tide pools, clung to the paper. He dismissed it as the book's age, but the scent lingered, unsettling. The hum intensified, a deeper resonance now, feeling like it was pressing in from all sides. He felt a strange compulsion to follow it, to trace its source. He found himself in the cramped study, a room he'd mostly avoided, filled with his grandfather's meticulous yet often indecipherable notes and charts. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. His eyes fell upon a small, lacquered wooden box tucked away on a high shelf, half obscured by a stack of maps. It was a box he hadn't noticed before, intricately carved with swirling, almost organic patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against a thin layer of dust. Beneath these, he found a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his grandfather's familiar, spidery hand. Unlike the other journals, this one was less about cartography and more about observation. The entries were increasingly frantic, less coherent. Dated just weeks before his grandfather's passing, spoke of the hunger from the deep, awakened by the folly at the research station. Dean paused. Research station. He remembered vague mentions from his childhood, hushed conversations about a failed, remote offshore facility, long abandoned. What folly had occurred there? What pact had his grandfather been trying to honor, or perhaps to break? He flipped to the last page, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't writing, but a crude, yet disturbing drawing. A swirling vortex of dark water, and within it, a grotesque, multi-limbed shape, indistinct yet undeniably menacing. Around the drawing, his grandfather had scrawled a single repeated word over and over, until it filled the margins like a madman's prayer. Resist, resist, resist. A sharp, metallic clang echoed from the kitchen. Dean slammed the journal shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hurried into the kitchen, his senses heightened. It hadn't fallen. It had been pulled, dragged a full foot from the burner. He backed away, his gaze darting around the room, searching for an explanation, for anything that would rationalize the inexplicable. The hum was a roaring in his ears now, pressing on his eardrums, vibrating behind his eyes. He stumbled back into the hallway, his reflection catching his eye in the antique looking glass by the coat rack. For a terrifying, elongated moment, it wasn't just his own gaunt, pale face staring back. Beneath his skin, just for an instant, a ripple. The contours of his jaw seemed to soften, to flow, like wax melting under heat. He blinked, hard, and the image snapped back to his own strained, terrified face. Nothing. The floorboards were bare, the air still. But he'd felt it. The hum reached a crescendo, a roaring wave of sound that threatened to tear his sanity apart. He could feel a pressure building, like being submerged at an impossible depth. It was amorphous, indistinct, a churning mass of darker-than-dark water, yet it held a terrible, predatory intelligence. It wasn't solid, yet it blocked out what little light filtered in from the distant living room. He could almost hear it breathing, a slow, deep exhalation that stirred the dust motes in the air. It was close now, too close. He could hear a faint, sloshing sound, like water trapped in a vast, unseen chamber. Dean squeezed his eyes shut, a desperate guttural scream lodged in his throat, unable to escape. It was going to touch him. It was going to claim him. Then, just as the tip of the aqueous form was about to make contact, a sudden, blinding flash of light from the lighthouse tower outside momentarily illuminated the hallway, cutting through the gloom. Dean slid to the floor, trembling, gasping for air, his eyes wide open, staring at the empty space where the horror had been. He was alone. The pact was stirring, and the deep had come for him. The clatter of the cast-iron skillet against the cold flagstones echoed long after the sound itself died, leaving a brittle silence in its wake. The faint, metallic sheen of the skillet on the floor seemed to mock him, a dark, inert presence. His mind raced, seeking a rational explanation. An old house, settling. A vibration from a passing boat, though none had come close in days. A draft, perhaps, strong enough to dislodge it from the stove. He repeated these possibilities like a litany, trying to quell the prickle of unease that crawled up his spine. Yet the skillet had been heavy, placed squarely. It shouldn't have moved. There was nothing, no sign of what might have caused it to fall. With a forced calm, he placed it back on the stove, its weight reassuringly solid. He cast a quick glance around the kitchen, at the familiar, if sparse, implements, the peeling paint on the window frame, the stubborn grit that seemed to cling to everything. Nothing was amiss. Dean returned to the living room, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. The incident in the kitchen, rather than deterring him, fueled a grim determination. He needed answers. He needed to understand what his grandfather had been entangled with, what secrets this desolate island truly held. He opened the journal again, the old leather creaking a protest. He skipped past the earlier, more observational entries, his eyes scanning for keywords, for a shift in tone. His grandfather's handwriting, once neat and precise, grew increasingly erratic in the later pages, sprawling across the lines, ink bleeding in places as if pressed with desperate urgency. The pact holds for now. The containment must be absolute. Periodic reinforcement of the wards is paramount. A fresh understanding of the deep song's cadence is crucial to its maintenance. Dean frowned, rereading the passage. Containment? Wards? This wasn't the detached observation of a curious mind. This was active involvement. He turned the page. Visited the research station again today. Their seismographs register anomalous subsurface vibrations. They dismiss it as unique geological activity, but Dean know better. The thrumming is growing stronger, closer. It tests the boundaries of the ritual. The offering must be prepared, or the balance will shift irrevocably. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The deep song, the pact, the offering. These weren't metaphors. They were components of a terrifying, tangible process. As he absorbed this new, horrifying realization, a low thrum began to resonate. Not from the floor or the walls, but from within his own skull. It was subtle at first, a vibration just beneath the threshold of hearing, like a heavy gauge cable stretched taut and plucked in the deepest part of the ocean. It pressed against his eardrums, a dull, persistent ache. He opened his eyes. The old wooden beams overhead appeared to twist, their familiar lines distorting, becoming something organic, sinuous. He blinked hard, rubbing his temples, convinced it was merely fatigue, a trick of the dim light. But the thrumming grew louder, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through his teeth, through the very bones of his skull. It was the deep song. "It knows you," he gasped, a dry, choked sound. His breath hitched. He wasn't alone. The feeling was overwhelming, a certainty that permeated every fiber of his being. He wasn't just being watched. He was being felt, probed by something vast and ancient. His gaze fell back to the journal, to a hastily scrawled sketch on a page near the back, almost hidden by a loose flap of leather. The thrumming intensified, guiding him, pulling him toward the lighthouse tower. His legs felt heavy, as if moving through deep water, yet he propelled himself forward, his eyes fixed on the narrow door leading into the tower's base. He found it beneath the spiral staircase, obscured by years of dust and forgotten crates. A section of the stone floor that didn't quite match the rest. It was a large rectangular slab, almost perfectly flush, but a hairline crack traced its perimeter. The deep song pulsed, a relentless rhythm against his very being, pushing him, urging him. With a surge of adrenaline, he found a small, almost invisible indentation on one side. He pressed. This was it. This was where his grandfather had enacted his desperate rituals. This was the root. And something down there was stirring. It was a current, an unseen river pulling him, and he had no desire to resist. His legs, heavy as if encased in lead, nevertheless propelled him up the spiral staircase within the lighthouse tower. Each worn step creaked under his weight, a lament swallowed by the overwhelming drone. The air grew colder, damp, carrying the sharp tang of brine mixed with something else, something ancient and metallic, like rusted blood. He climbed, his hands scraping against the rough, cold stone of the inner wall. The light from the small, grimy windows that punctuated the ascent offered no comfort. They merely framed the swirling gray of the perpetual fog, a suffocating shroud around the island. Dean's breath hitched, a dry, ragged sound in his own ears. Yet he felt no fatigue. Only this relentless, singular drive. Finally, he reached the top, the small, circular room where the lamp housing should have been. But there was no lamp. Instead, a heavy, rusted metal door, set flush into the stone, confronted him. The thrumming emanated directly from behind it, a living pulse. Dean reached out, his fingers numb, and felt the cold, gritty metal. He didn't question how he knew what to do. His hands moved with an almost preternatural certainty, sliding each bolt back with a grating shriek that grated against the thrumming. The final bolt gave way with a mournful groan, and Dean grasped the circular handle, turning it. A gust of air, thick and rank with the smell of stagnant water and something indescribable. A mineral earthiness, a faint sweetness that curdled the stomach, washed over him. He stepped through, the door swinging shut behind him with a heavy clang that echoed unnaturally, cutting off the outside world. He was plunged into absolute blackness, the thrumming now a deafening roar that vibrated through his entire body. He fumbled for the lantern he hadn't realized he was still carrying. His trembling fingers struggled with the catch, finally coaxing a weak, sputtering light into existence. This wasn't a natural cave. And then he saw it. A rudimentary research station. Faded charts, brittle with age, were tacked to the walls, depicting intricate, swirling patterns that looked like oceanic currents, or perhaps something far more abstract, annotated with symbols Dean didn't recognize. Rusted metal devices, some resembling antique diving bells, others like complex astrolabes made for an alien sky, sat dormant, coated in a fine layer of mineral dust. A large, shallow basin, carved directly into the stone floor, was filled with a murky, viscous liquid that seemed to absorb the light. But it was the center of the chamber that drew his gaze, compelled his very being. There, dominating the space, was the source of the thrumming. It was a monolith, not of stone, but of a substance he couldn't identify. It was vaguely crystalline, yet also organic, like petrified bone or chitin from some colossal deep-sea creature. The thrumming intensified, reaching a crescendo that threatened to split his skull. He could feel its presence, vast and ancient, resonating from the monolith, radiating out into the very air. This was no mere artifact. It was a gateway, a wound in reality. He stood before it, hypnotized, his mind stripped bare. And then the vision struck him. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a pure, unfiltered influx of knowledge, a terrifying cascade of images that bypassed his optic nerves and plunged directly into his consciousness. He saw the island, his island, not as solid land, but as a porous, crumbling husk. He saw the lighthouse collapsing, its light swallowed by the black. And then he saw himself. He was standing on the cliffs, the wind whipping at his clothes, but his body was no longer his own. He was becoming part of it, an infinitesimal fragment in a vast, indifferent consciousness that stretched beyond the bounds of time and space. A consciousness that had been sleeping beneath the waves for eons and was now ravenously, inexorably waking. The vision snapped shut, leaving Dean gasping, his knees buckling. He stumbled back, colliding with one of the rusted instruments on the research station table, sending it clattering to the floor. The thrumming, though still present, seemed to recede slightly, allowing him to draw a ragged breath. The entity wasn't just stirring, it was reaching. And it wanted the island. It wanted him. The spiral staircase, slick with brine and the damp breath of the sea, offered no purchase. Yet Dean's feet ascended, each step an involuntary submission. The thrumming had ceased to be an external vibration. It was now within him, a low, guttural growl that resonated in his skull, behind his eyes. He felt less like he was walking, and more like he was being drawn, a puppet on invisible strings, towards the lantern room at the pinnacle of the lighthouse. He emerged into the lantern room, the colossal lens a cyclopean eye staring out into the churning, fog-choked expanse. But the light was dim, flickering, struggling against an encroaching gloom that seemed to emanate from within the very glass. The thrumming reached a crescendo, a soundless scream that filled his perception, drowning out the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves. His vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into a swirling vortex of gray and black. Then, it was there. Not a shape, not a form, but a presence. It wasn't visible to the eye, yet it pressed against him from all sides, a boundless weight, cold and wet and utterly malevolent. It was a hunger, vast and patient, and it sought to consume not his body, but the very essence of him. This was a direct assault, an invasion. He recoiled, a gasp tearing from his throat, but there was no air, only the suffocating pressure of the entity. He was losing himself, becoming a vessel, an empty shell for something unspeakably old and alien to his world. With a surge of desperate animalistic will, Dean fought back. He screamed, a guttural roar that ripped through his burning lungs, and it was enough. It receded, a vast, silent sigh of frustration, leaving him gasping, trembling, slumped against the cold metal railing of the lantern room. His head throbbed, a dull ache behind his eyes, but his mind, though shaken, was his own again. He was trapped, truly trapped, the island a cage, the lighthouse a beacon for his impending doom. It wanted in, it wanted him. He had to find a way to stop it, to seal whatever ancient wound allowed its presence to bleed into his reality. His grandfather's journal. It was his only hope. The research station was a small, squat building, almost hidden by the rocky outcrop it clung to, a short distance from the cottage. It was a place of forgotten charts, strange specimens, and his grandfather's increasingly frantic notations. The wind shrieked, whipping his hair, tearing at his clothes. The air tasted of salt and impending doom. The small structure, weathered and gray, appeared as a defiant outpost against the relentless storm. He fumbled with the rusted lock, his fingers numb, finally forcing the door open with a groan of protest from the hinges. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper, dried seaweed, and a faint, cloying sweetness. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with specimen jars containing things he dared not examine too closely, and stacks of yellowed maps. A heavy wooden table dominated the center of the room, littered with instruments and more ledgers. He snatched it up, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning for anything, any clue. His grandfather's precise looping script filled page after page, detailing observations of the deep, strange currents, and increasingly, fragmented accounts of something beneath. He recognized the symbols, the crude drawings he had dismissed as the ramblings of a lonely old man. Now they screamed with meaning, with a horrifying truth. He found it on a particularly stained and brittle page near the back. It wasn't a complete ritual, but a series of desperate notes, half-finished diagrams, and cryptic warnings. His grandfather had been close. So terribly close. Must be closed. Not sealed from without, but from within. A resonance. A mirror. Sacrifice. Sacrifice. He read on, his breath catching in his throat. The method wasn't about brute force or banishment. It was about offering something, a terrible exchange, to quiet the entity, to turn its gaze away, to close the rift it sought to exploit. It was a payment, a blood price for the island's continued existence, for the world's continued sanity. The pages that followed were torn, or perhaps never written, leaving the exact nature of the sacrifice agonizingly vague, yet the implication was clear. It wasn't a goat or a treasure. It was something profoundly, irrevocably personal. Something that would break a man or make him into something else entirely. Sacrifice. The word had echoed in Dean's skull, a cold, terrible chime that vibrated in his teeth. He had read on, his breath catching, the old paper crinkling under his trembling fingers. The method wasn't about brute force or banishment, the journal explained. Outside the cottage, the world had begun to unravel. The subtle shifts of the past weeks had coalesced into a full-blown assault on reality. A ceaseless, keening wind shrieked around the eaves, not a natural gale, but a sound laced with something predatory, a hungry whine. Dean pressed his forehead against the cool glass, peering out. The few gnarled pines that clung to the island's crags were no longer just bent by the wind. Their branches twisted and writhed, shedding needles that seemed to dissolve into black dust before hitting the ground. The sea, usually a tempestuous but familiar force, had taken on an oily, unnatural sheen. Waves crashed against the rocks with a sickening slurp, pulling back to reveal not sand, but patches of glistening, dark matter that pulsed faintly before being swallowed again by the next surge. He saw a gull attempt to land on a familiar rock, only for its wings to seize, its feathers to ripple and peel away like old paint, leaving behind raw, exposed flesh that shimmered with an iridescent, sickening glow. It dropped, a broken, twitching thing, into the dark water. This was it then. The entity wasn't just stirring, it was reaching. It was reshaping the world in its own image, and the island was its canvas. The psychic pressure was immense, a crushing weight in his chest, a constant low thrumming behind his eyes that threatened to split his skull. But a stubborn ember of resolve still burned within him. He pulled back from the window, the journal clutched tight. He flipped pages, his gaze darting across the grandfather's frantic scrawl, deciphering the increasingly fragmented sentences. The journal spoke of a specific location, a nexus point, where the veil between worlds was thinnest, where the offering could be made. It was not the lighthouse itself, but a place further inland, where the island's geological structure formed a natural conduit. The words blurred, then sharpened. The sacrifice, the journal revealed, wasn't merely an object or a life. It was a connection, a severing of the thread that bound the entity to this world, a thread that had been woven into the very fabric of the island's oldest families. And the only way to sever it was to offer something intrinsically linked to that connection, a part of the self, a memory, a lineage, a piece of the soul, perhaps, or the very essence of one's identity. The true horror of it settled over Dean like a shroud. This wasn't just about stopping the entity. It was about paying a price that would fundamentally alter him. The journal ended abruptly, a half-finished sentence trailing off into a frantic sketch of a crude symbol and a name. The research station. Dean knew the place. It was a dilapidated, long-abandoned structure, built by a short-lived geological survey team decades ago, nestled in a sheltered cove on the island's leeward side. He had seen it on his maps, a forgotten dot, but had never ventured there. Now, it was his only hope. He gathered what he needed: the journal itself, a heavy oil lantern, his grandfather's old, tarnished brass compass, and a coil of rope he wasn't sure he'd need but took anyway. Each item felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Stepping out of the cottage was like entering a different dimension. The air was a tangible force pushing against him, tasting of salt and rot. He stumbled over uneven ground, the path to the research station barely visible, the familiar landmarks distorted into monstrous silhouettes. The trees groaned, their branches scraping like skeletal fingers against the unseen sky. He heard the distant guttural roar of the waves, a sound that seemed to come from inside the earth, not from the sea. He pressed on, the compass clutched in one hand, the lantern swinging wildly in the other, casting a small, flickering circle of light that only intensified the surrounding gloom. It wanted him to break, to surrender. It was a low, squat building, made of weather-beaten wood and corrugated metal, half swallowed by the encroaching vegetation. But the vegetation wasn't normal. Vines as thick as his arm writhed around the walls, covered in bulbous gray growths that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. The air here was even heavier, charged with a palpable humming energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. This was it. The nexus. The place where the sacrifice would be made. Dean looked down at the journal, at the terrifying implications of the final entries. He knew the cost. A profound sadness washed over him, deeper than any fear. But beneath it, a desperate, fierce determination hardened his gaze. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the entity's presence, and placed the journal carefully on the table, next to the stones. He was ready. Dean clutched the heavy, leather-bound book to his chest, its brittle pages a cold comfort against the damp chill that had settled deep into his bones. The research station, a skeletal frame of rotting timbers and rusted corrugated iron, offered little shelter. The ink spoke of forgotten tides, of cyclical awakenings, and of a binding that demanded more than just observation. It spoke of a sacrifice. The air outside was thick, not with fog, but with a palpable pressure, as if the very atmosphere of the island were compressing around him. The sky was an unbroken canvas of bruised purple and gray. The wind, a mournful keen that promised a storm of monstrous proportions. Dean felt a grim determination solidify within him, a stark counterpoint to the dread that still gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He had come too far, lost too much to falter now. The lighthouse, a stark sentinel on the distant bluff, was his destination, his battlefield. The trek was a battle against the elements and an unseen adversary. Each step was a deliberate, heavy effort. It was the entity, fully roused, its presence a suffocating cloak wrapped around the island. The sea churned with an unnatural violence, waves crashing against the cliffs with a sound like splintering bone. The very structure of the lighthouse seemed to writhe, its ancient stone walls appearing to bulge and recede under the immense, unseen pressure. A sickly, sweet brine odor, like decaying kelp and something far more ancient, stung his nostrils, making him gag. He saw movement in the churning water below, vast, indistinct shapes shifting beneath the surface, hinted at by the sudden, profound displacement of water. He reached the heavy iron door, its surface encrusted with salt and rust, and pushed it open. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through the very soles of his feet, climbing into his chest, making his teeth ache. He began the ascent, his hand scraping against the rough stone of the spiral staircase. He saw their face, contorted in silent accusation, then replaced by a monstrous gaping maw, teeth like jagged shards of obsidian. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, forcing the images away, focusing on the weight of the book in his hand, the promise of the ritual. He reached the lamp room, the vast lens spinning slowly, erratically, casting its unsettling green glow. The room was not empty. The thrumming was now a roar, a silent scream that tore at his sanity. This was it, the revelation. His grandfather's scrawled notes, now clear in his mind's eye, explained it all. The entity fed on grief, on loss, on the very fabric of human connection. Not just to his past, but to his capacity for future joy, for future love. It demanded the sacrifice of his very soul's ability to heal. He fumbled open the book, his fingers trembling, and laid it on the worn wooden table beneath the lamp. He traced the ancient symbols, the complex sigils that his grandfather had painstakingly copied. He began to chant the words from the book, a guttural, ancient language that felt alien on his tongue. As the words left his lips, the air in the room became charged, crackling with unseen energy. The green light intensified, then flickered wildly. The entity retaliated. He felt a sharp, burning pain erupt in his chest, as if an invisible hand were tearing at his heart. He gasped, dropping to one knee, but he kept chanting, his voice raw. He closed his eyes, picturing his partner's face, their smile, the warmth of their hand in his. He held on to the memory, cherishing it, knowing this was the last time he would ever truly feel it. It was the only way to truly seal it, to deny it the sustenance it craved. The pain in his heart, the phantom agony, vanished, replaced by an unsettling absolute stillness. A guttural shriek, not from him, but from something vast and ancient, tore through the lamp room, shaking the very foundations of the lighthouse. The green light flared, blinding him, then imploded. The thrumming ceased. When Dean opened his eyes, the room was still, the lamp spinning evenly, casting its normal white beam out into the now calm moonlit night. The air was clean, devoid of the foul odor. The fissures in the walls remained, but they no longer wept. He was alone. The entity was gone, sealed away. But something else was gone too. He felt it, a profound, aching absence where his deepest emotions once resided. He had sacrificed his capacity for true feeling, for love, for joy, to save the island, to save himself from its encroaching madness. He had found what he needed here, tucked away in the final water-stained entries of the old keeper's ledger, a desperate addendum to a legacy of silence. His grandfather and the keepers before him hadn't simply guarded the lighthouse. They had maintained a precarious balance, feeding the pact with their solitude, their vigilance, their very presence. The entity wasn't trying to escape. It was trying to reclaim what it saw as its own, what had been taken from it by the ancient binding. The deep song was its insidious lullaby, a siren call meant to draw a new keeper into its embrace, to complete the cycle. The last keeper had failed, or perhaps refused, and the tether had frayed, allowing the entity's influence to seep and spread. Dean understood now. The book in his hands detailed not just the history of the island, but the true nature of the pact. A symbiotic horror, a mutual dependency. The island, or perhaps a vein of ancient power beneath it, drew strength from the entity's slumber, while the entity demanded a constant, conscious awareness of its presence. A solitary mind to act as its anchor, to keep it from fully awakening, yet always aware of its potential. It demanded him. The thought was a leaden weight in his gut, but a grim determination solidified in his resolve. He had to stop it, not just for himself, but for whatever remained of the world beyond this fog-choked rock. He pushed open the creaking door of the research station, the groan of rusted hinges echoing the island's ceaseless lament. The fog had thickened, swallowing the horizon, blurring the line between sea and sky. The deep song, muted in the station, swelled around him, a resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth, his bones. It was a language without words, pure sensation, a profound sense of wrongness that threatened to unravel his thoughts. His destination was clear: the lighthouse, the heart of the island's ancient defense. The path was treacherous, slick with moss and seaweed, the wind a constant buffeting force. Each step felt like a battle against an invisible current, as if the island itself was pushing his back, protecting its monstrous secret. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else, something fetid and ancient, like deep-sea mud disturbed after millennia. The beams swept over him, a brief, dispassionate eye in the swirling mist. He opened the book to the final page, its brittle parchment crackling in the wind. The instructions were simple, terrifyingly so. No elaborate incantations, no arcane symbols, just a binding, a conscious act of will, and a profound, internal surrender. He closed his eyes, the deep song roaring in his ears, threatening to drown out all other thought. He focused on the words, not reading them aloud, but letting them sink into his mind, into his very being. He imagined a vast gaping maw beneath the waves, its hunger and emptiness that echoed his own grief. And then he offered it something. Not his life, not his body, but the part of him that connected to the mundane world, his clarity, his peace. He offered it his sanity as an anchor, a new tether. The deep song vanished. The roaring ocean softened to a distant sigh. The air cleared, the fetid smell dissipating, leaving only the clean scent of salt and ozone. Dean opened his eyes. The threat was neutralized. But the cost was everything. He looked at the island, and it was no longer just a place of rock and mist. It was a living, breathing entity, and he was now inextricably linked to it, a silent sentinel bound by a pact no one else would ever understand. He could still feel the echo of the deep song, not in the air, but deep within his own mind, a persistent, low thrum beneath the surface of his thoughts. It was a constant reminder, a secret knowledge that would forever separate him from the world he once knew. The island was quiet now, but the silence was not peace. It was the vast, echoing quiet of the deep, and Dean was its sole shattered listener,